Let's jump right into this explainer. We're looking at a staggering public health crisis that is literally happening right inside our own bodies, and it's hiding in plain sight. Most of us assume that exposure to synthetic herbicides is, well, something that only happens if you happen to live right next to some massive commercial farm. But the latest biomonitoring data, it reveals a completely different reality about systemic metabolic disruptions.
Just look at this number, 87%. The CDC ran this extensive urinalysis across a huge national group, and they found that an absolutely shocking 87% of tested children and 80% of adults actually have detectable levels of this industrial weed killer right in their urine. Let that sink in. This isn't some rare, isolated thing. This is systematic saturation. It means that the vast majority of us are continuously processing this chemical through our internal organs every single day.
And the reason we're continuously processing it is because it's deeply penetrated our everyday staples. It's moved way beyond those rural farming zones and landed directly on our local grocery store shelves. We're talking about measurable chemical residues in the exact things we eat and drink on a daily basis. Your morning oatmeal, your bread, infant formulas, even commercial beers and wines. It's what we call a subclinical chemical inundation, basically an ongoing cellular insult that we absolutely have to understand if we want to protect our long-term health.
Section 1. Why food is contaminated, the Trojan horse.
So, to understand exactly how this gets into our food in such massive amounts, we've got to look at two fundamental shifts in industrial agriculture. They basically act like a Trojan horse on our dinner plates. The first shift was the introduction of GMO Roundup-ready crops back in the 90s, right? These crops were engineered specifically to withstand direct, repeated chemical drenching, which leads to over 200 million pounds being sprayed every year. But here is the real Trojan horse: harvest desiccation. This is where they deliberately spray the chemical as a drying agent directly onto non-GMO grains, like wheat, oats, and barley, right before harvest. Because they do this right before processing, the highest concentrations of these residues are left intentionally on the exact foods heading straight for our kitchens.
Section 2. The regulatory blind spot. Now you're probably wondering, how on earth is this widespread exposure actually legal? Well, that brings us to a massive contradiction, a real regulatory blind spot between global scientific bodies and the US EPA. Picture this. You have two premier scientific organizations looking at the exact same data, but they come up with wildly opposite conclusions. On one hand, the World Health Organization rigorously reviewed the evidence and officially flagged glyphosate as a probable human carcinogen. But on the flip side, the EPA just stamped it with a blanket safety approval, claiming it's not likely to be carcinogen.
This massive contradiction finally hit a breaking point in the legal system. In 2022, a federal appeals court actually threw out the EPA safety review altogether. The court found that the agency had systematically ignored valid animal studies that showed clear tumor development. They literally called the EPA's behavior arbitrary and divorced from its own guidelines. Wow, and it gets crazier. Unsealed court documents expose this whole network of corporate ghostwriting, where industry scientists were writing foundational safety studies but publishing them under independent academic names. Plus, they uncovered a clear revolving door between regulatory administrators and the very biochemical corporations making the herbicide.
Section 3. Structural formulations and absorption. The regulatory failure actually gets even worse when you look at how these chemicals are tested versus how they're actually mixed and applied out in the real world. You see, safety frameworks usually only test pure, isolated glyphosate, but out in the field, commercial herbicides are never used in isolation. They rely on something called the adjuvant synergy effect. Basically, commercial formulas mix the glyphosate with industrial surfactants and adjuvants, chemicals specifically designed to break down cellular barriers. Peer-reviewed research shows this makes the complete mixture vastly more toxic than just the pure chemical alone. And because these additives break down barriers so well, transdermal absorption, meaning it literally soaks right through your skin, becomes a huge accelerated risk for agricultural workers, landscapers, and even everyday residential users.
Section 4. Destroying the microecosystem, the antibiotic bomb.
Okay, let's look at how this impacts public health on a massive scale when these chemicals are actually ingested. It acts like a literal antibiotic bomb going off inside your gut. The biological chain reaction here is fascinating. For decades, the industry told us this herbicide was perfectly safe because human cells lack something called the shikimate pathway. Sounds logical, right? But that argument completely ignored a foundational pillar of human biology: Sure, our human cells don't have this pathway, but our vital gut microbiome, those trillions of helpful microorganisms that run our immune system, relies entirely on that exact shikimate pathway to survive. So when you eat food covered in these residues, the chemical blocks that pathway directly.
Here's why that is so devastating, and why it specifically destroys our beneficial bacteria. The herbicide acts as this potent, broad-spectrum antibiotic that systematically murders your internal defense system, specifically essential strains like lactobacillus and bifidobacterium. Because those good guys need the shikimate pathway, they're just eradicated. But here is the kicker. Highly pathogenic, disease-causing bacteria are left completely unharmed because they're naturally resistant to the chemical. So it wipes out the good guys and leaves the bad guys. This triggers severe intestinal dysbiosis, degrades your gut barrier, and drives chronic, systemic inflammation all over your body. It is a direct link between this everyday exposure and the broader decline we're seeing in public health.
Section 5. The Replacement Conundrum. Toxic home replacements. Now, because of public pressure and, over $11 billion paid out in cancer settlements, the industry quietly phased glyphosate out of residential home weed killers back in 2023. Sounds like a win, right? Well, the cure might actually be worse than the disease. If you go to the hardware store today, those modern consumer formulations use a cocktail of 4 incredibly aggressive replacement chemicals. Data shows this new mix represents a 45-fold increase in acute human toxicity compared to the old formula, and it actively triggers severe intestinal damage on contact. One of them, diquat dibromide, is so hazardous it's strictly banned across the EU and China. And yet, the bottles on our shelves look virtually unchanged, with 0 warnings to the public about these elevated risks.
Section 6. 3 steps to detoxify.
Okay, I know this all sounds incredibly grim, but listen, we are not helpless here. We have a highly structured biological solution to help you clear these chemicals from your system. Basically, there are 3 proven ways to detoxify and execute a full gut recovery process. Step 1, enforce strict organic grain isolation to stop the influx of toxins. Step 2, reconstruct your gut microbiome matrix to repair the damage. And Step 3, optimize your hepatic clearance to flush the accumulated chemicals right out through your liver. Let's break down exactly how to pull this off.
All right, step 1 is all about instantly cutting off the dietary source of the toxin. You've got to transition exclusively to certified organic grains. That means completely eliminating conventional wheat, commercial oats, and standard breakfast cereals, because organic standards strictly ban these synthetic herbicides. Then we move to step 2, the gut recovery process, where you fight back against that antibiotic effect. You do this by actively reseeding your digestive tract. We're talking about aggressively flooding your system with dense, traditional fermented foods that are packed with live, active cultures. Things like raw, unflavored kefir, traditionally prepared sauerkraut, and cultured vegetables. This delivers a massive wave of robust lactobacillus and bifidobacterium strains to literally crowd out that pathogenic overgrowth and heal your intestinal lining.
Finally, step 3 is where we focus on systemic clearance. Since these chemicals make their way into your bloodstream, supporting your liver, which is your primary organ of detoxification, is absolutely non-negotiable. You want to load up on sulfur donor compounds. You can find these in cruciferous vegetables like broccoli and Brussels sprouts. What this does is optimize your body's internal glutathione production, giving your liver the exact biological tools it needs to bind, neutralize, and safely excrete these accumulated chemicals. Oh, and if you're someone who loves data, you can even establish biomarker baselines using a specialized urinalysis test to actively track your cellular clearance as you adopt this clean lifestyle.
The evidence here is undeniable. The biological mechanism behind how this destroys our microbiomes is crystal clear, and those 3 steps to detoxify and recover are completely in your hands. Our regulatory agencies might have stamped this stuff as safe, but as we've seen today, our bodies are telling a vastly different story. So now that you're armed with this knowledge, the only question left is, will you change what's on your plate?